The driving social justice issue of your generation is pro-life. And that's why it's a privilege for me to introduce our next guest, Stephanie Gray. I've been hearing about Stephanie Gray, I think, for 16 years. And if you want to know how to most effectively share the pro-life message, this is the woman to talk to. She is from Canada. There's some more Canadians here. I live in Hawaii, and this time of year, half of my state is from Canada. So let's give a pro-life generation welcome to Stephanie Gray, pro-life leader, pro-life hero.
Thank you very much. It is always wonderful to come to the United States of America. Now, I wanted to begin not talking about your country or mine, but someone who was living in England many decades ago. And in 1938, this man was a very successful stockbroker in England, and he was going to take a lovely ski vacation in December of 1938. And just before he was going to go on his vacation, a friend of his called, and this friend was essentially doing missionary work, you could say. He was helping people in Czechoslovakia who were forced to live under horrible conditions just prior to the start of the Second World War. And he called this man by the name of Nicholas Winton, his friend, and he said, "Will you come to Prague and will you help me?" So Nicholas Winton abandoned his plans to go on his vacation, and instead he went over to Prague. And he saw these horrible conditions, as I say, that the people were forced to live under. And what he observed when he was there was that there was an effort being made to help adults escape. But nothing was being done to help children escape. Nicholas Winton saw a need, and he responded to that need. He then went back to England, and he got permission from the government in England as well as Sweden for them to allow families within their countries to welcome children into their homes to keep them safe during the war. And so in the months preceding World War II, from March of 1939 until August of 1939, 8 trainloads of children were taken from Czechoslovakia to the safety of families in Sweden and England. Nicholas Winton once said there is a difference between passive goodness and active goodness. There is a difference between passive goodness and active goodness. The latter is, in my opinion, the giving of one's time and energy for the alleviation of pain and suffering. Nicholas Winton saw a need, and he responded to that need with active goodness. And as a result, 669 children were spared murder from the Second World War. Their lives were preserved because Nicholas Winton had active goodness. As I have reflected on all that he did, it occurred to me that what makes his efforts different from our efforts is that he could simply take the children out of the dangerous situation that they were in. We can't remove preborn children whose lives are threatened by abortion. We cannot take them out of the womb. And so as much as we are called to the kind of active goodness that Nicholas Winton lived out, we can't do it in the same way. We must use instead our powers of persuasion. We must compel the woman in crisis and everyone around her who has the power to influence her. We must compel them to defend life, to look at the preborn child and recognize that child is unrepeatable and irreplaceable and worthy of respect and protection. And so this morning, what I want to do is help equip you to be able to use the powers of persuasion to convince people to protect preborn children from abortion. In order to do that, I'm going to explain what I consider to be a new approach for how to dialogue with people. And it's an approach that I employed in a conversation I had with a teenager just a couple years ago. A teenager and I were debating about abortion outside his high school. And he was quite animated and passionate. He was cutting me off. He was talking really loud. He was very angry. And at one point in his anger, he looked at me and he goes, well, what if you have a 12-year-old girl raped by her father, pregnant with a deformed fetus, and she's gonna die? And I stood there thinking, wow, okay, just take one of these scenarios, and that's a difficult situation to deal with. But he just had to take all the hard cases and lump them into one. And because he had been cutting me off, I thought, how am I going to adequately respond to each one of these points so that he actually listens and receives? And then a thought came to my mind. And the thought that came to my mind was to ask myself a question. What did this student really say to me? If we listen closely enough to the people who are in front of us, what we will discover is we will hear things they don't even say. What was behind his words? What was he really saying but not verbalizing? Because if I could figure that out, and if I could respond to that, then maybe I can win him over. And so in a very quick passage of time, I quickly thought to myself, what he actually said to me is, what if you have a 12-year-old girl and her circumstances are hard, they're really, really hard. And the moment I translated what he'd said to that, I thought to myself, well, this is going to be difficult because I can't make the pro-life view easy. I can make it easier to carry through with the unplanned pregnancy, with support and journeying with a woman through that crisis. I can make it easier, but I can't make it easy. And this guy's thinking, look, if her circumstances are really, really hard, she needs an abortion. How do I respond? So my first response was to at least affirm that I'd heard what he'd actually verbalized. I said, there's a lot there, and those are fair questions. Because for the people who are in those circumstances, those are very real crises, and they deserve a response. And I promise you, I'm going to respond to each one of those. If you'll bear with me, I said to him, part of answering your question is to ask you one. And then I explained even further before I got to my question. I said, and the question I'm going to ask you might seem off topic, but I promise you, if you'll bear with me, the question is very relevant to the questions you just asked me. And so at that point, he went quiet because he's intrigued by this mysterious, discussion that all these points that I've mysteriously made. And so then he's quiet. I look at him and I say, is there anyone who inspires you? And the guy who was cutting me off and quite angry went quiet. But he was quiet for so long, I thought, oh my goodness, what if this guy lacks inspiration? So I started to give him examples. And I said, someone you know in your family, or maybe someone you've never met but has lived in the history of the world and you've just heard about them. I said, or maybe the person who inspires you isn't a real person. Is there someone in a book you've read or a movie you've watched who's a mere character, but they have had a positive influence on how you feel and how you think and even how you behave? Is there anyone who inspires you? He said, yes, there is. And I said, excellent, who is it? And he said some name, and I had no clue who this person was. But I didn't need to know. All I needed to know was the prayer of St. Francis, which in the middle of the prayer says, O divine master, grant that I may not so much seek to be understood as to understand. So I just had to know I need to seek to understand this guy and everything he knows that I don't know. So I said, I don't know who this person is. Would you tell me about him? And so he began to describe this guy. He was a boxer, and he was from a family of boxers, and he'd gone through a lot of turmoil in his life. A couple of his relatives had committed suicide. So this student continued to describe this guy, and I continued to ask questions in order to seek to understand what was it about this boxer that this teenager found so inspiring. And so as I was asking questions and drawing more out and learning about the suffering he faced in his family, I asked, did he give up on his life, or is he turning his obstacle into an opportunity? He said, no, he's great at what he does, and he's got a beautiful family himself, and he's not despairing when times are tough, and he overcomes obstacles. And he was telling me all this stuff, and then as I was drawing more and more out of him, what I ended drawing out of him is what I have drawn out of people all over the world who I've asked that very same question. Who inspires you? And what I've discovered is that I get different answers for who. But there is a common theme for why the people who inspire us inspire us. And I've discovered that what sets apart those who inspire from those who do not is not that the inspiring person has led an easy life. It's typical that the person who inspires has led a life of suffering, but what sets them apart from all the others is how they respond to the suffering they face. They put others before themselves. They have perspective. In the face of an obstacle, their perspective change says, I can look for an opportunity. And finally, I have discovered that people who inspire us tend to do the right thing even when it's hard. Once I had drawn all of these truths out of him through seeking to understand, through asking questions, once I had identified that this particular student was inspired by someone who put others first, had perspective, and did the right thing even when it was hard, I took those core beliefs from him, views he already held dear. And I showed how the views he already held dear very much apply to the situations he just asked about. The 12-year-old girl raped by her father, pregnant with a deformed fetus, and she's going to die. I asked him to consider if he was inspired by the boxer who put others first, had perspective, and did the right thing even when it was hard, then shouldn't we do the same thing in moments of crisis, like that which the young girl may face? Put others first, have perspective, and do the right thing even when it's hard. And so what I want to do in the time we have together this morning is expand on each one of those points to show how if we can use questions which enable us to understand and stories which make ideas and principles more clear and comprehensible, to elaborate on these 3 points, then I think we can defend the pro-life view well. And I think we can win people to the pro-life perspective. So let's take that first quality, that of putting others before ourselves. If I were to ask you, thinking about our present day culture, if you think the culture is generally selfless or selfish, which would you say? Selfish. Unfortunately, it seems that way. With a lot of our rhetoric, with a lot of the choices we make, it seems like we're in a very selfish culture. Yet I believe deep down in our heart of hearts, we know that that is not the way to live. We know that the ideal is that we are more focused on others than ourselves. A few years ago, I was debating with a university student about abortion. And as we were bantering back and forth, it was becoming very clear to me that his rhetoric was very, very selfish. And it was so shockingly selfish, I was tempted to just look at him and say, you sound really selfish. But if I had said that, he probably would have done one of two things. The first option would have been to say, no, I'm not. At which point I could have said, yes, you are. And he would have said, no, I'm not. And I would have said, yes, you are. And that wouldn't have been very fruitful in the conversation. The other option that he might have responded with was to say, yeah, so. And then I would have been like, oh boy, what do I do now? So instead I thought to myself that what is written on his heart is written on my heart. And it's a truth that will set us free. And what is written on our hearts is a desire for the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that means putting others before ourselves, because that is true, and that is good, and that is beautiful. I don't need to convince this guy to be selfless. I need to ask him questions and tell stories to draw out of him that he already holds that view. And it just so happened that there had been a news story recently occurring at the time he and I were discussing that I drew on to make the point that deep down he knew we should be selfless. When he made one of his comments, I said, what you just said is very interesting. It reminds me of a story I heard about in the news recently. You've probably heard about it yourself. There was this captain of a cruise ship that had been steering his ship a little too close to an Italian village. And he grounded his ship and it started to sink. And some people lost their lives. Do you remember the story? I asked him. How many of you remember that story? A good number of you. And unfortunately, I'll tell you what he did, and then we'll see how that has repeated itself in even more recent news. But I said to the student who remembered it, I said, this made international news. Not just because of the accident, not just because people lost their lives, but why? I asked him a question. Why did that particular story rock the world, draw the world's attention? What element of the story shocked people? Who remembers? What's it? Because the captain of the ship abandoned the ship before everyone got off. And the students said this, and I said, and our world looked at that and said that was right or wrong. What do you think he said? Wrong. I asked another question. Why? Because I wanted to draw the truth out of him. And he said, well, he failed in his responsibility to his dependents, to the people around him who were vulnerable, because a captain has knowledge and insight, and he has responsibility to use that for the safety of the people in his midst. Unfortunately, what that captain did in abandoning his ship by putting himself before others was something that occurred even more recently, approximately a year ago. There was a captain not of a cruise ship, but of a ferry in South Korea that had several hundred teenagers on a field trip. And that ship hit rough waters. There was a storm. It capsized. Several hundred lost their lives. But the world was outraged in this incident as it was in the previous incident. And again, it wasn't merely the accident. It wasn't merely the loss of life. But it was the fact that in that case as well, the captain abandoned ship. And our world back then with the cruise ship and presently or more recently with the ferry looked at these incidents and said what those captains did was wrong because they put themselves before others. So then I said to this student, now there was another major passenger vehicle accident that also drew the world's attention and also involved the actions of a captain that caused people to look closely at what had gone on. But in this passenger vehicle accident, it wasn't a cruise ship, it was an airplane. Several years before the cruise ship accident, almost to the day, a U.S. Airways plane had taken off from LaGuardia Airport in New York. And as the plane was taking off, my country got in the way. In fact, I should apologize on behalf of my country, but our Canadian geese decided to take the exact same flight pattern as that U.S. Airways airplane. And so as the plane was going up and our Canadian geese were going up, suddenly the Canadian geese got sucked into the engines of the airplane, and both engines had immediate failure. And the captain of the airplane, Captain Chesley Sullenberger, realized he needed to make an emergency landing. But he also knew he did not have time to get to any of the nearby airports. And so he realized he had a choice to make. Crash his plane into the buildings of New York City, or do his best to land his plane as safely as possible on the Hudson River. I'm just going to skip ahead here. If I could just have AV, I believe my picture of that very plane should be coming up. Is this, it's on. Note to self, don't let the laptop close. There we go. All right. This became known as the miracle on the Hudson, where indeed Captain Sullenberger was able to safely land his plane. And when that plane would have come to a stop on the water of the Hudson River, besides everyone probably, calling out for joy that they were still alive, hopefully they would have remembered the emergency protocols that I, as a frequent flyer, typically tune out. Just before the plane takes off, they say, in the event of a water landing, and that's when I don't pay any attention because I think to myself, in the event of a water landing, I'm dead. And then this happened, and I thought, I need to pay attention. So hopefully everyone in the airplane had paid attention. In the event of a water landing, you do what? You grab your life jacket, which is either below your seat or it is your seat, and then what do? Proceed to Not just the exit, but the nearest exit. And they often say, don't forget to look behind you. It might be right there. So everyone at the back of the plane, see, I am starting to pay attention. So everyone at the back of the plane would have gone to the back. But what they didn't realize is that the tail of the plane was tucked down in the water. The first person who gets to the door whips the door open and welcomes in the Hudson River. And so now water is flooding into the cabin. And as everyone is getting away from the back of the cabin, escaping out the middle doors and the front doors, one person, Captain Chesley Sullenberger, is walking towards the back of the cabin. As everyone's getting off, he's staying on. And as water was filling the airplane, he walked the aisle twice to make sure no one was left on the plane. He was the last person to get off. I looked at the student I was speaking with and I said, "What did our world say about him?" What do you think the student said? "A hero." "Right," I said, "why?" And he said, "Well, because he put others before himself." I said, "Do you think he made the right choice?" What do you think he said? "Yes." So I said, "It seems to me that you believe that the example we should follow in our world is not one in which we're selfish, like the captain of the cruise ship, or more recently, the captain of the ferry, but rather the example that we should follow is one in which we put others before ourselves instead of ourselves before others." That's what Captain Sullenberger did. And we know what he did was true and good and beautiful, so we should follow that with our own lives. Now, what sometimes happens if you use stories like that in dialoguing with people is they'll say, "Okay, well, fair enough, but there's a big difference here. Captain Sullenberger did a great thing because he had others in his midst that he needed to put before himself. But when a woman is pregnant, there is no other individual there. It's just her. So I agree with you, we should put others before ourselves, but only if there's someone else there." And so what we often have to do in conversation is prove to the person we're dialoguing with that the preborn child is an other. That preborn child is equal to the passengers on the airplane, and just as if we should put those people before ourselves, then that woman should put her preborn child before herself. It doesn't mean that she loses her life in the same way Captain Sullenberger didn't lose his, and he's alive today. But what it does mean is that we are more outward focused than inward focused. So what we often have to do is establish that the preborn child is an other, like the people on the airplane. How do we do that? Well, the question I like to ask people to focus the conversation on that topic is to say, do you believe in human rights? What do you think they'll say if you ask that question? Yes. So then I'll say, what about this human's rights? And hopefully we're now synced up. Yes, we are. Excellent. What about this human's rights? What do you think the person will say upon seeing this image of a one-celled embryo? That's not a human. So then I ask another question. Well, what are her parents? Is the pregnant woman human? Is her partner human? If yes, then wouldn't it follow that the embryo must be human? Because two human parents can't produce a cat, right? It can't happen. So if we want to know what something is, we ask, what are her parents? And because the parents of the embryo are human, then the embryo must be human. And then the abortion supporter may say, well, even if the embryo's human, the embryo's not alive. So we ask another question. Is the embryo growing? Is the one cell splitting into 2 and then 4 and then 8 and 16? And if by her growth, which we know is happening, or if she's growing, wouldn't it then follow that she's alive? And then at that point, the abortion supporter may say, well, it's just a fetus. Well, if they're to say that the preborn child is just a fetus, we ask another question. What kind of fetus? After all, what's that? A dolphin what? A dolphin fetus. So by asking questions, we show that other species have fetuses. If we want to know what something is, we don't ask if the thing is a fetus, we ask what are the thing's parents? Are the parents dolphins? Are the parents dogs? Or are the parents humans? Because what the parents are will determine what the offspring are. Fetus is an age category. When the fetus is born, I'll ask people I speak with, what do we refer to that fetus as? A baby. And when that baby turns 2, what do we refer to the baby as? A toddler. And when that toddler turns 13, what do we refer to the toddler as? I'm hearing different answers. I once gave a talk, and an elderly woman piped up, impossible. That's what we call her. When impossible turns 21, what do we call impossible? Maybe other labels. An adult. And so the very line of questioning I asked you is what I would ask someone in conversation, in order to draw out of them that they and I share the idea or share the belief that in our species we have words to refer to age ranges that tell us how old something is. And the word fetus is like the word baby, toddler, teenager/impossible, adult, that all these words tell us how old someone is, but not what someone is. We determine what they are by asking what are their parents. And so because we know the parents are human, the offspring's human. Because we know the offspring is growing, we know the offspring is alive. And since we have a living human and we believe in human rights, it would follow that the human right to life that you and I have is a human right to life that living human has as well. At that point, the abortion supporter may say, well, even if it's a living human, surely at fertilization it's not a living human when you're dealing with something the size of a period at the end of a sentence. Well, if we believe that right now we're living humans with human rights, then it would follow the whole time that we've existed, we've been living humans with human rights. So at what point did our lives begin? There are 3 options. Option 1 would be before fertilization, when we have the sperm and the egg by themselves. Option 2 would be at fertilization. And option 3 would be sometime after fertilization. And we can very quickly rule out the first option by simply asking a question. Will the eggs in a woman's body without any sperm in her body, will those eggs grow and mature into an adult human? No. Will the sperm in a man's body grow and mature into an adult human? No. And so we see that the sperm and the egg by themselves are merely human parts. When they come together at fertilization, it forms a whole human who admittedly is smaller and less developed and in a different environment and more dependent than a born human. But a born human is also smaller and less developed and maybe in a different environment and more dependent than a human who's 15 or 20 if that born human is merely an infant. The sperm and the egg by themselves differ from all of us in kind. Human parts versus whole human. But the embryo, the fetus, or even the infant and toddler differ from all of us by degree. We're the same kind, but there's certain degrees of things about us that are different when we compare one to the other. The degree of our size, the degree of our development, the environment that we may be in, or the degree of our dependency. That varies from one individual to the next according to how old we are. But what we are as human beings is determined at fertilization. And from that point forward, we just need time to grow and develop. When I was once speaking to a group of students in the 7th grade, I said to these students, giving them a very simplified pro-life presentation, I said to them, I want you to imagine that I'm an alien from another planet who's come to Earth for the first time, and as I encounter you earthlings, I hear you talking about people. Imagine I don't know what a person is. If you had to define a person for me, how would you do it? Now, the reason I ask these students this question is because what often happens in the abortion debate is abortion supporters will divorce the idea of human from person. And they'll say a human is what you are biologically, but a person is much, much more. If you can think, if you can reason, if you have conscious thoughts, if you're self-aware, if you're rational, you're a person. And they'll say because the one-celled embryo can't think or reason or is self-aware at that moment, the embryo's not a person. And so I asked these students how they would define person to someone who didn't know what a person was in order